In the spring of 1955, a professional hunter named John Hunter stood over a dead elephant in the northern frontier district of Kenya. The animal had charged from 40 yards. Hunter had fired once. The elephant was dead before it completed the charge. The rifle in his hands was not a military weapon. It was not a product of any government arsenal. It had been built by 8 men in a workshop on Pentonville Road in London, a room so small that 2 gunsmiths could not pass each other between the benches without turning sideways. The cartridge it fired had been designed in 1911. By 1955, every professional hunter working the Selous, the Luangwa Valley, and the northern frontier carried one, or wished they did. 33 years later, that workshop closed forever. But the real story of John Rigby and Company is not the closure. It is the story of how a gun-making family from Dublin built a cartridge so precisely calibrated to the physics of dangerous game that no rival has fully displaced it in 114 years. Every week, we tell the stories of the engineers, the factories, and the decisions that built or destroyed the world's most important firearms brands. Subscribe if it matters to you. The story begins in Dublin in 1775. Dublin in 1775 was not yet a gun-making city. The trade belonged to London, to Birmingham, to the proof houses and guild workshops that had controlled British arms manufacturing since the reign of Charles II. Dublin had linen merchants and wool factors and the slow commerce of a colonial capital. It did not have a gun quarter. John Rigby changed that. The historical record on Rigby's earliest years is incomplete. What survives, in Dublin Guild registers and the company's own ledgers, preserved in fragments at the London Proof House, establishes that John Rigby opened a gun-making workshop at 24 Suffolk Street, Dublin, in 1775. His age at founding is not precisely known. His training is not fully documented. What is documented is the quality of what came out of that workshop. He was, by every surviving account, a lock filer by formation, a craftsman whose specific skill was the internal mechanism of a flintlock, the frizzen spring, the tumbler, the sear that held the hammer at half-cock until the trigger released it. Lock filing was the most demanding subspecialty in gun-making. A lock filer worked in tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, with hand files and scrapers, fitting each component to each action individually. There was no interchangeable parts doctrine in Dublin in 1775. Every lock was a unique object, fitted by hand to a specific gun, and it would never fit another. This is the foundational difference between the tradition John Rigby inherited and the one Samuel Colt would later industrialize across the Atlantic. Colt's American system, components machined to tolerances so precise that any part fit any gun without hand fitting, was a philosophical revolution in manufacturing. Rigby's tradition ran in the opposite direction. Precision achieved not by machine, but by the accumulated judgment of a craftsman's hands. Slower, more expensive, and, for certain purposes, unrepeatable. By 1800, the Suffolk Street workshop had established a reputation that reached beyond Dublin's merchant class. The records suggest Rigby was producing between 30 and 50 long arms per year, a figure that sounds modest until one understands that each one required between 60 and 200 hours of skilled labor. These were not production rifles. They were arguments about what a gun could be made to do. In 1818, the business passed to his son, William Rigby, and then to William's son, John Rigby II, who made the decision that would transform the family trade into a dynasty. In 1865, John Rigby II opened a London address, first at 72 St. James's Street, later settling at premises on Pall Mall, the street that housed the most prestigious gunmakers in the English-speaking world. Holland and Holland were nearby. James Purdy and Sons were nearby. To open on Pall Mall was not merely a commercial decision. It was a declaration of competitive intent made in public in the most competitive street in the British gun trade. The London operation required capital. The figure is not precisely documented, but company correspondence of the period indicates that the Dublin and London operations ran concurrently for several years. The Dublin workshop producing working guns for the Irish market, while the London address served the clientele that would define the company's next century. Colonial administrators, military officers, professional hunters, and the aristocracy of a British Empire at its territorial peak. The market gap that John Rigby II identified was specific. It was not a gap in the revolver market, or in military service arms, or in the shotgun trade that dominated the Pall Mall establishments. It was a gap in the rifle, specifically in the heavy rifle designed for large, dangerous animals at close range in conditions where a second shot was not guaranteed. The existing options were inadequate. The large-bore muzzle-loaders of the mid-Victorian era were slow to reload and inconsistent in terminal performance. The early centerfire cartridges of the 1860s and 1870s were designed for European game: red deer, chamois, boar. They had not been engineered for an animal that weighed 6 tons and could cover 40 yards in under 3 seconds. He had spoken to the men who hunted those animals. He understood the failure in their hands. The .416 Rigby cartridge was not invented in a moment of inspiration. It was engineered in response to a specific failure. By 1905, the British East Africa Protectorate had become the most intensively hunted territory on Earth. The Uganda Railway had opened the interior. The professional hunter trade, men who guided wealthy clients after elephant, buffalo, lion, and rhinoceros for fees that could reach £500 per safari, had become a recognizable profession with recognizable professional standards. And those standards included a recognized problem. The existing heavy calibers were borderline. The .450 Nitro Express and the .470 Nitro Express, double rifle cartridges designed for the break-open actions built by Holland and W.J. Jeffery, were effective but mechanically constrained. They were designed for double rifles, 2-barreled guns that offered a second shot without cycling a bolt. Fast, reliable, and expensive. A matched pair of Holland and Holland double rifles in .470 Nitro Express cost, in 1905, approximately £120, roughly 3 years' wages for a skilled London craftsman. The professional hunters who needed them most could rarely afford them. The bolt-action rifle was the alternative. Cheaper to manufacture, faster to produce a third and fourth shot. But the bolt-action rifles of the period, Mausers, Lee Enfields, early Mannlichers, were chambered for military cartridges. The 7x57mm, the .303 British, cartridges designed to kill men at 300 yards, not buffalo at 30. Their bullets were too light. Their sectional density, a measurement of a projectile's mass relative to its cross-sectional area, which determines how deeply it penetrates a target, was insufficient for the skull plate of a charging elephant or the shoulder muscle mass of a Cape buffalo that might weigh 800 kilograms. John Rigby and Company's head designer, working from the Pall Mall premises in the years between 1908 and 1911, approached the problem as an engineering problem. The constraints were precise. The cartridge had to fit a bolt-action magazine. Specifically, the Mauser Model 98 action, the strongest and most reliable bolt mechanism then available. It had to generate enough energy to reliably penetrate the frontal skull of an African elephant, a bone structure at its thickest point, measuring 12 inches of dense cancellous tissue. And it had to do so at the ranges at which dangerous game was actually encountered, under 50 yards, often under 20, in grass that might be taller than the hunter. The solution arrived in 1911. The .416 Rigby, formerly designated the .416 Rigby Rimless, was a cartridge of unusual physical dimensions. The case length was 2.90 inches. The overall cartridge length was 3.75 inches, so large that the Mauser 98 action required a magnum-length receiver to accommodate it. The bullet diameter was .416 inches, 10.57 millimeters. The standard load drove a 410-grain bullet, a projectile weighing just under an ounce, at a muzzle velocity of approximately 2,370 feet per second. Muzzle energy, approximately 5,100 foot-pounds. To place that figure in context, the .303 British service cartridge, standard issue to every British soldier on the Western Front 7 years later, generated approximately 2,400 foot-pounds of muzzle energy. The .416 Rigby generated more than twice that, from a bolt-action rifle, fitted into a magazine that held 4 rounds. The rifle built around that cartridge was not a production item. It was a commission. Each one was built to the client's specification, length of pull measured to the inch, stock wood selected by the buyer from Rigby's own blanks, barrel regulated to the specific ammunition lot the client intended to carry into the field. The process took, by the company's own records of the period, between 6 and 18 months from deposit to delivery. The price in 1912 was approximately £75, roughly 25 weeks' wages for a senior London bank clerk, and less than 2/3 the cost of a comparable Holland and Holland double rifle. The cartridge specification lock-in came not from a patent. Rigby held no monopoly on the .416 bore diameter, but from ammunition. Within 3 years of the cartridge's introduction, Kynoch of Birmingham, the dominant British ammunition manufacturer, had standardized .416 Rigby as a catalogue load. That decision was not paperwork. It was the moat. Once Kynoch committed to producing .416 Rigby ammunition at commercial scale, stocking it in Nairobi, in Mombasa, in the outfitters on St. James's Street, the cartridge became self-sustaining. A professional hunter in the northern frontier district of Kenya could order .416 Rigby ammunition by telegraph and receive it within a fortnight. No other heavy bolt-action cartridge of the period had that logistical infrastructure. The early clients were not civilians in any ordinary sense. Frederick Courtenay Selous, the most celebrated professional hunter of the Victorian era, whose African journals had made dangerous game hunting comprehensible to the British reading public, carried a Rigby rifle. John A. Hunter, whose career spanned 4 decades and included government-contracted elephant culls in Kenya, numbering in the thousands, shot a Rigby for most of his professional life. Dennis Finch Hatton, the hunter made famous decades later by his association with Karen Blixen, was a Rigby client. The ivory traders operating out of Mombasa bought Rigby rifles because the men they trusted most recommended them. By 1920, the .416 Rigby was not one option among several. In the professional hunter community of British East Africa, it was the reference point against which all other dangerous game cartridges were measured. The decade between 1910 and 1920 remade John Rigby and Company twice. The first remaking was commercial. The second was imposed by war. By 1913, the Pall Mall premises had become something more than a gunmaker's shop. They were a clearinghouse for intelligence about dangerous game hunting across the British Empire. A place where a newly appointed district commissioner, bound for Uganda, could sit across a counter from a man who had personally corresponded with every professional hunter working the Rift Valley, and leave with a rifle regulated to the ammunition he would carry, fitted to his specific measurements, and backed by a network of outfitters who stocked Rigby components from Nairobi to Calcutta. The institutional buyers reflected the reach of that network. The British East Africa Protectorate's Game Department, the colonial authority responsible for wildlife management and increasingly for elephant control operations, standardized on Rigby rifles for its field officers. The Sudan Political Service, whose administrators governed one of the largest colonial territories on earth from postings in Khartoum and Juba, placed recurring orders through the London office throughout the 1910s. The Indian Army's Officer Corps, men who hunted tiger in Mysore and Madhya Pradesh on furlough and required a rifle that performed equally on Indian and African game, represented a significant portion of Rigby's pre-war order book. The Maharaja of Bikaner, whose shooting parties in Rajasthan were among the most extensively documented in the sporting literature of the period, was a Rigby client. So was the government of British Nyasaland, which contracted Rigby to supply rifles for its elephant control program in what is now Malawi. None of these were casual purchases. Each represented a deliberate institutional choice made by men whose professional survival, in some cases their physical survival, depended on the decision. Production figures for the pre-war period are not fully preserved. The company's commission books, the primary record of bespoke orders, indicate that the London workshop was completing between 40 and 70 rifles per year in the years immediately before 1914. In an industry where Holland and James Purdy each employed over 100 craftsmen, that figure sounds small. It was not small. It was the entire productive capacity of 8 to 12 gunsmiths working at the highest level of the London trade. Men whose waiting lists ran to 18 months and whose work was measured not in units per shift, but in actions fitted, barrels regulated, and stocks inlet by hand to tolerances that a feeler gauge could verify, but a machine could not yet achieve. Then, August 1914 arrived. The War Office mobilization order reached Pall Mall within days of the declaration. John Rigby and Company, like every British gunmaker of consequence, was directed to suspend civilian production and redirect capacity toward military supply. The specific contracts varied by firm and by quarter. For Rigby, the primary wartime contribution was the production and repair of pattern 1914 Enfield rifles, the precision-built alternative to the standard Lee Enfield, manufactured to tighter tolerances for use as a sniper's weapon, and the servicing of damaged military arms returned from the Western Front for rebuild and reissue. The craftsmen who had been fitting .416 Rigby actions to Magnum Mauser receivers were now fitting pattern 1914 strikers and extractors to rifles that had come back from Passchendaele with mud in the action and shell fragments in the stock. The work was different. The standard was the same. The stakes were not abstract. A pattern. 1914 Enfield, issued to a sniper in the Ypres salient in 1917, was expected to deliver accurate fire at ranges exceeding 600 yards in weather that ranged from Belgian summer to sub-zero winter, maintained by a soldier who had not been trained as a gunsmith and could not return the rifle to a workshop if the trigger pulled inconsistently. If the sear engagement was incorrect when the rifle left the repair bench, the sniper carried that error into the field. There was no margin. There was no second chance to adjust the trigger. The Rigby workshop received no Army-Navy E award. That was an American designation. The British equivalent, the Board of Trade Commendation for War Production Contribution, was awarded to several London gunmakers of the period. Whether Rigby received formal recognition is not confirmed in the surviving records. What is confirmed is that the workshop operated continuously from 1914 to 1918 without interruption, and that the pattern 1914 rifles that passed through it met proof house standards on retest. The men who had built those rifles came back from the war changed. Several did not come back at all. The commission books show a gap. Orders placed in 1913 and 1914, delivery dates noted as deferred, duration of hostilities, fulfilled in some cases as late as 1921. The clients who had placed those orders had survived the war, or their estates had. Either way, the rifles were eventually delivered. The interwar period was the commercial peak. Professional hunting in British East Africa, Kenya colony, after 1920, had formalized into a licensed industry. The East Africa Professional Hunters Association established standards for licensed guides. Safari companies operating out of Nairobi, Newland, Tarleton and Company, Safariland Limited, equipped their professional staff with Rigby rifles as a matter of policy. The white hunter of the interwar period was a recognizable cultural figure, and the 416 Rigby was his professional instrument in the same way that a surgeon's preferred scalpel was not interchangeable with the ward's standard issue. The cartridge itself was gaining independent momentum. Kynoch's catalog for 1923 listed .416 Rigby ammunition in 3 bullet configurations: the full metal jacket for elephant, the soft point for buffalo and lion, and the solid for penetration on the heaviest game at extreme angles. Ammunition was available through Rigby's own London premises, through the East Africa Outfitters, and through the Army and Navy Stores catalogue, the mail-order institution that supplied the British colonial world with everything from tinned biscuits to canvas tents to centre-fire cartridges. New models emerged from the Pall Mall workshop during this period. The Rising Bite double rifle, Rigby's answer to the Holland and Holland Royal, offered clients who wanted a double-barreled option in .416 caliber, a mechanically elegant alternative to the bolt-action magazine rifle. The takedown configuration, introduced for clients who traveled extensively by steamer and required a rifle that disassembled into a fitted case small enough to store in a cabin trunk, became a signature Rigby offering. Each variation was not a new product line in any industrial sense. Each was a bespoke solution to a specific client's specific problem, documented in the commission books and never exactly repeated. By 1935, the name John Rigby and Company meant one thing in the professional hunting world with a precision that few commercial brands achieve. It meant a bolt-action rifle in .416 caliber, built in London by hand, regulated to shoot to point of aim at 100 yards with Kynoch ammunition, and capable of stopping a charging elephant with a single frontal brain shot at distances that left no margin for a second attempt. That precision of meaning was the company's greatest commercial asset. It was also, in the decades that followed, its most acute vulnerability. The vulnerability had a specific date. On the 12th of July, 1956, Winchester Repeating Arms Company of New Haven, Connecticut, announced a new cartridge, the .458 Winchester Magnum. It was designed for bolt-action rifles. It fit a standard-length Mauser action without modification. It was loaded by Winchester at a price point that undercut Kynoch's .416 Rigby ammunition by a margin that the colonial hunter on a government salary could not ignore. And it claimed, in Winchester's own technical literature, to match the terminal performance of the .416 Rigby on dangerous game. The claim was contested by professional hunters who had used both. The argument did not matter commercially. What mattered was that the .458 Winchester Magnum was American, was cheap, and was available. The post-war firearms market in East Africa was no longer supplied exclusively through London outfitters and Kynoch catalogues. American ammunition had arrived in volume, carried by American hunters on American dollars, following the safari tourism boom that Hemingway's journalism and Hollywood's cameras had ignited across the 1950s. A Nairobi outfitter in 1958 who stocked 458 Winchester Magnum could supply half his clients from a single American distributor. A Nairobi outfitter who stocked .416 Rigby depended on Kynoch shipments from Birmingham on a production schedule that was already becoming unreliable. That unreliability was the second blow. Kynoch, formerly Imperial Metal Industries after a series of corporate reorganizations, began rationalizing its ammunition catalog in the late 1950s and through the 1960s. The logic was industrial. Low-volume specialist cartridges consumed tooling time and warehouse space that could be more profitably allocated to high-volume military and sporting calibers. The .416 Rigby was a low-volume cartridge by any commercial measure. Kynoch's production records are not fully public, but the ammunition trade literature of the period documents the progressive disappearance of .416 Rigby from standard catalog listings. By the mid-1960s, a professional hunter in Kenya who needed .416 Rigby ammunition was placing a special order, waiting months for delivery, and paying a premium that reflected Kynoch's diminishing enthusiasm for the caliber. A cartridge without reliable ammunition is not a cartridge. It is a historical object. The third blow arrived from the map. Between 1957 and 1968, the British Empire in Africa ceased to exist as a functioning administrative structure. Ghana in 1957, Nigeria in 1960, Tanzania, Uganda, Kenya between 1961 and 1963, Zambia, Malawi in 1964. The institutional customers who had sustained Rigby's order book for half a century, the colonial game departments, the district commissioners, the political service administrators, were gone. Their successors, the wildlife authorities of independent African nations, did not place orders on Pall Mall. The professional hunting industry survived decolonization in modified form. Licensed safari hunting continued in Kenya until 1977, when the Kenyan government banned hunting entirely. It continued in Tanzania, in Zambia, in Zimbabwe. But the professional hunter of the post-colonial era was operating under different economics. The old network, London Outfitter, Kinnoch Ammunition, Rigby Commission Books, 18-month waiting list, had been built for a world that no longer existed. What John Rigby and Company offered had not changed. That was precisely the problem. The London gun trade contracted through the 1960s and into the 1970s with a consistency that admitted no misreading. The Proof House records show declining submission volumes across the West End makers. Holland reduced its workforce. James Purdy survived by pivoting aggressively toward the American luxury market, wealthy collectors and wing shooters who could afford 5-year waiting lists and prices denominated in tens of thousands of pounds. Rigby had neither the shotgun reputation that drove Purdy's American sales, nor the financial resources to reposition the brand before the window closed. The commission books from the 1970s are sparse. Orders came in, fewer than before. The craftsmen who retired were not fully replaced. The institutional knowledge that lived in a London-best gunmaker's hands, the specific feel of a correctly fitted bolt, the sound of a regulated barrel, the judgment that no specification sheet could capture, was leaving the workshop one retirement at a time. By 1980, the Pall Mall address was gone. The operation had consolidated to smaller premises. The workforce had contracted to a handful of men. The order book was still open. The trajectory was not. In 1988, John Rigby and Company closed. 213 years of continuous gun-making operation. 8 craftsmen. The assets were sold. The name transferred. The commission books went into storage. The Mauser actions on the bench, half-fitted, awaiting stocks that would now never be inletted, were catalogued and dispersed. The last rifle had already left the workshop. No one had known it was the last. The proof mark on its barrel flat read, London. The address below it no longer existed as a functioning gunmaker's premises. The door closed. The benches stood empty. The files and scrapers stayed where the last craftsman had left them. The name did not stay in storage. In 2009, a small group of investors acquired the John Rigby and Company trademark, the commission books, and the remaining assets. The new ownership was based not in London, not in Dublin, but in San Diego, California. The decision to resurrect a 200-year-old London gun-making firm from the American West Coast was, by any conventional measure, an improbable one. The people behind it, led by a collector and firearms historian named Mark Newton, understood that improbability and proceeded anyway. The California operation began producing Rigby rifles on Mauser 98 Action sourced from European suppliers, fitted with stocks shaped to the original Rigby patterns, chambered in .4-16 Rigby as a matter of deliberate continuity. The rifles were not built in London. They were not built by men trained in the London-best tradition. They were built to a specification derived from the commission books and the surviving pre-war examples that Newton and his colleagues had studied in private collections and auction catalogues. The results were, by the account of the collectors and hunters who examined them, serious rifles, not identical to the pre-war originals. Nothing built in California in 2012 could be identical to something built in London in 1932 by a craftsman who had spent 40 years developing the specific manual judgment that the work required. But serious, purposeful, honest about what they were. In 2016, the operation returned to London. John Rigby and Company re-established a physical presence in the city where the firm had built its reputation, at premises in Wapping, east of the city. away from the West End gun trade that no longer existed in its Victorian form. British craftsmen were hired. The commission books were reopened in their original form. A client places a deposit, specifies his requirements, and waits. The waiting list, as of the most recent public statements from the company, runs to approximately 18 months. The address on the barrel flat now reads London again. The secondary market for pre-war Rigby rifles tells a story that no marketing material could construct. At Rock Island Auction Company, the premier American venue for collector-grade firearms, pre-war John Rigby bolt-action rifles in .416 caliber have sold in recent years for figures between $30,000 and $90,000, depending on condition, provenance, and the documentation accompanying the rifle. A Rigby with its original commission book entry, the client's name, the specification, the regulated ammunition lot. The delivery date commands a premium above an otherwise identical rifle without that paper trail. The vintage arms collectors who pursue pre-war British dangerous game rifles, a community organized around publications like the Double Gun Journal and the forums of the British Sporting Arms Society, treat the pre-war Rigby as a primary reference object, not a curio, a functional standard. Several professional hunters working in Zimbabwe and Tanzania today carry pre-war Rigby rifles as their primary dangerous game arm, not from sentiment but from a professional assessment that the regulation and fitting of those rifles has not been matched by anything produced since. The ammunition problem that helped kill the company has been resolved by the market it helped create. Federal Premium, Hornady, and A Square all produce .416 Rigby ammunition in commercial quantity. The cartridge that Kynek abandoned in the 1960s is now loaded by 4 American manufacturers and available through standard sporting goods distributors in every state that permits dangerous game ammunition sales. The moat, emptied once, has been refilled from an unexpected direction. The physical site of the original Pall Mall premises is now occupied by commercial retail. No interpretive panel marks the address. No plaque identifies the building as the place where the commission books recorded the orders of the Sudan Political Service and the game departments of 3 colonial territories. The London gun trade that once occupied the West End, the proof houses, the barrel borers, the stockmakers who supplied the finished blanks, exists today in fragments, maintained by a handful of firms whose combined workforce would not have filled 1 floor of the old Holland and Holland factory. The surprise the commission books contain is this. Among the clients recorded in the pre-war ledgers is a name that appears not as a hunter, but as a collector. A man who ordered a .416 Rigby in 1936 and collected it in 1937, fired it once at proof, and placed it directly into a fitted case that was not opened again for 30 years. The rifle exists today in a private collection in Edinburgh. It has never been to Africa. It has never been fired at an animal. It is, by every measurable standard, in the condition it left the Pall Mall workshop 87 years ago. The proof mark is clean. The bore is pristine. The stock shows no handling wear beyond the single session at the proof range. It is the most complete surviving record of what the workshop produced at its peak, not because it was preserved with deliberate care, but because it was simply never used. What John Rigby and Company represents in the longer history of arms manufacturing is not a story about guns. It is a story about the specific relationship between a tool and the environment it was designed for. The .416 Rigby cartridge was engineered for a precise set of physical conditions: large, dangerous animals, close ranges, bolt-action reliability, available ammunition logistics in remote territory. Every element of its design was a response to a documented field requirement. When those conditions changed, when the colonial infrastructure dissolved, when the ammunition supply contracted, when the American market redefined what a dangerous game cartridge needed to cost, the tool did not change with them. It remained what it had been designed to be. That inflexibility was a failure of commercial adaptation. It was also a form of integrity. The firms that survived the second half of the 20th century did so by becoming something other than what they had been. John Rigby and Company, in its original form, declined to do that. Whether that constitutes failure or principle depends on what one believes a gun-making firm is for. The evidence suggests it was for this: a bolt thrown on a Mauser 98 action, fitted in London to a specification written in a commission book in 1929. Chambering a .416 Rigby cartridge loaded by Kynoch to a standard that has not been improved upon in 100 years. Cycling cleanly, seating correctly, delivering to the barrel what the barrel was regulated to receive. Still doing, in the hands of a professional hunter in the Longwa Valley, exactly what 8 craftsmen on Pentonville Road built it to do. See you in the next one.